All right, it's time to start. And since these are new days, new times, we have something called GDPR, whatever that means. But I have to ask your consent for this being recorded, filmed, and there's Twitter going on. And since you haven't said anything, you've accepted it. Okay. Welcome to this EBA seminar, The Fluctuating Value of Aid, which is arranged by EBA, the expert group of aid studies. My name is Arne Bigsten. I'm here today in my capacity as a member of the EBA. I chaired the reference group for this interesting study and presented today, and I will moderate this seminar. Just a few words about the expert group. You should know about it by now, I think, if you've been in contact with us before, which most of you have, I would think. But it's a government committee set up to contribute to the improvement of Swedish development cooperation. So in collaboration with researchers and other experts, we analyze and evaluate Swedish international development assistance. We focus primarily on the overarching issues within Swedish development cooperation, not sort of individual project analysis. EBA defines independently the issues to be studied and examined, and the authors who write the reports are responsible for the analysis and the recommendations, so we have a sort of double independence here. In order to bridge the gap between policy, researchers, and practice, our seminars provide a forum for dialogue and discussion between various practitioners and researchers involved in this area of development cooperation. So this is also the ambition of today's seminar. We have the pleasure of launching a report on exchange rate volatility and its effect on predictability and effectiveness of Swedish bilateral aid. The title of the report is How Predictable is Swedish Aid? A Study of Exchange Rate Volatility. It's written by political scientist Númi Östlund, who is a former senior performance auditor of the Swedish National Debt Office and since 2017, director of Aid Hedge. The seminar will be organized as follows. First, we'll have a presentation of the report by Númi, followed by comments by our three commentators, and a conversation on the subject with them here on the stage. We aim to conclude at 3:30, and we hope and expect that we'll have time for some communication interchange with the audience before we get to that stage. If you want to Twitter or send stuff from here, there is some hashtags here you can relate to, EBA seminar, DevPol, etc. behind me. And I also would like to mention that there is another working paper on a related issue called Volatility in Swedish Foreign Aid, the case of 6 long-term partner countries. It's a broader issue of fluctuation of aid, not specifically related to exchange rate volatility, although it's part of it. So that's sort of the practicalities. And before I ask Númi to enter the stage, I might give you a few words on my own. And I do think that the question of aid volatility and its negative implications on aid effectiveness, they have been discussed for a long time and have been taken up in international commitments and agreements. But the provision of adequate and predictable means of developing countries to be included. This is to be included in one of the objectives for the SDGs, and this is something we are committed to. So fluctuating aid exchange rates affect aggregate volatility, but the scope of this problem specifically about individual aid activities and the risk distribution has not been researched very much at all. So I was very happy when Númi took this task on to analyze this under-researched issue. Swedish multilateral aid, usually about 1/3 of our aid, is normally provided in US dollars. This means that the risks of exchange rate volatility is borne by the Swedish. Something that we have started to insure against to some extent. But Swedish bilateral aid is, however, given in Swedish currency, Swedish kronor, which means the exchange rate risk is borne by the recipients. This is the issue that has yet not been handled well by the Swedish aid apparatus, I would say. So with this report, EBA hopes to shed some light on the very important issue, which has been, to a large extent, neglected so far. I think a lot of people who are out in the practical world are aware of it, but we haven't really had sufficient discussion and analysis and tools put in place to deal with it. So Númi has done an extensive and pioneering work, I think, on this important issue, on how to manage exchange rate volatility to make Swedish bilateral aid more predictable. And predictability of aid is important for its efficiency. We know that from other studies. So I'm therefore glad that we now have him here to present the study. So please, Númi.
Thank you, Arne. And hi, everyone. I thought I'd do a live reading of the report, but apparently I only have 20 minutes, so I'll try and summarize the report briefly before our discussion. And I thought I'll do quite a straightforward presentation and basically first say a few words of the study as such, the methodology, but focus mainly on the findings and the results, which I think is the most interesting part. And then finally, some words on the recommendations. But I won't spend too much time there because I think the discussion afterwards will be focused on the opportunities and the possible solutions here. So we'll discuss that more afterwards. And about the study briefly, so I've been trying to understand, given the fact that quite a lot of our aid is given in Swedish crowns, but our partners mainly work in other currencies, how does that affect predictability and the implementation of Swedish funded activities? So I've looked at all activities during 2006 to 2016, as they've been reported to IATI, the International Aid Transparency Initiative. So it's the same date that you have in OpenAid, for example. So I've taken all those activities and then tried to analyze them from a currency perspective, looking at where are they implemented, what kind of organizations, and trying to understand how will this funding be affected, given that rates fluctuate up and down. And as Arne said, I've been focusing on the bilateral side of things, as that's where we always give in Swedish crowns. I have some words on the multilateral side, but the focus is on the bilateral activities. And I really like to emphasize, when it comes to methodology, there's thousands of activities. So I've done quite a lot of generalizations, and there is quite a lot of assumptions also being made in this analysis. I'm scratching the surface here, and given the wide array of different types of activities, there will be a lot of things that fall out of this analysis. But hopefully it's the start, and I've tried to qualify the assumptions somewhat by visiting Zambia and Rwanda, talking to SIDA staff, controllers, program officers, also partner organizations and a few other donors locally to understand how is this affecting activities, how do budgets work, how do contracts, what do they look like, to try and to bring this a bit closer to reality as well. And the findings then, if we focus on that, I thought I'll summarize it in three parts. First of all, the main focus of the report is predictability and fluctuations with exchange rate and funding. So that's the main thing. But I'll also talk a little bit about the coping mechanisms, how partners I've spoken to manage these fluctuations, what kind of strategies they use. And finally, a little bit of a different topic is the fact that we use different currencies. How does it affect reporting and transparency when we in OpenAid and IATI and so on? I've been analyzing the total portfolio for 11 years, but I thought maybe to start out we just look at one hypothetical project to see how this can affect funding. So I've just sketched here a very simple project where we say that SIDA has committed 50 million crowns to a project running over 3 years, that with an agreement signed a year and a half ago, with 5 payments of 10 million crowns each. And the organization has a budget that's saying, okay, I will get 10 million crowns, that's 1.1 million US dollars, that's our working currency, that's what we budget for. So this is the reality of a simple agreement. But another reality is this. So this is the uncertainty that grows over time for an organization like that. Because of the fact that they are working in US dollars, but we are providing funding in Swedish crowns. So they'll have a growing uncertainty the further away they look or try to plan or budget in that project. Where they have a first disbursement of funds in the same year as they sign the contract, the kind of uncertainty or the amount of predictability will be plus minus 8%, more or less. That's plus minus about $100,000 that they have to take into account. And that uncertainty grows the further away they look. So in the end, the final disbursement, it's about triple that, plus minus 23%. And if we look at this project today, so it's a year and a half in, so we'll have, this is the actual US dollar rate over that time, so we'll see that the price of the dollar has decreased. We've had 2 disbursements, and the organization has received amounts that differ quite substantially from what they budgeted with. In this case, they've gained quite a lot of dollars, but 10% in the first one, and I think around 5% in the second one. And as you see where we are today, we still have an uncertainty for the last 3 disbursements. How much will we actually receive for those in those disbursements? And of course, a big question for the organization is how will we manage these new resources that we have? So this is briefly what it looks like in one project, but of course, I think we have about 3,000 activities per year that we fund. And there's a wide array of different currencies used, a lot of different kind of organizations being funded. So trying to understand the total effect on Swedish aid, the analysis takes into account a lot of different currencies. The biggest one will be US dollars, but there are, of course, a lot of other ones that affect how predictable Swedish aid is. And there will be big differences between different organizations or partners, what kind of predictability they have. If they work with dollars, it's something, but if they work in perhaps a small local currency, the uncertainty will likely be much higher. And this is a picture of the total portfolio for each budget year. So on this side here, we say we have committed funds, and then each year stretches out 5 years, and you see how the value of each year's funding changes with rates over a five-year period. And you can see how these 11 years start to look like this uncertainty cone, so to speak. And some years it goes up. 2009, if you had a contract signed that year, you have a lot of gains. And other years go up and down, or only down. So you have the big finding here is the uncertainty. And here I really like to emphasize again that this is the aggregated view, but for as an individual organization, the result might look completely different because they work with specific currencies. And also, this is just one part of the picture. Organizations, partners, recipients that we work with, they often work with other donors, of course. So they might have incoming fundings not only in Swedish crowns, but in British pounds, Norwegian crowns, so on, that they have to manage. But they might also have, on the other side, regional projects with costs in a lot of different countries and different currencies, or even international organizations working with many currencies. So the situation, the predictability might be quite complex, quite daunting for a single organization. So this is the overall picture that's painted in the report. And of course, one main follow-up question is, how do the organizations manage this if it fluctuates this much? And I think talking to organizations and looking at a few other reports and papers the main conclusion is, well, you manage. you manage when funds fluctuate, when disbursements come, and they differ from budgets. You manage, you add activities, or you remove activities, or you might ask SIDA for a no-cost extension, or so on. You manage the situation, and this is only one, of course, one factor affecting how predictable their funding is. There will be a lot of others. Will they get funding? Which donors have money this year, and so on. Two other findings are quite interesting that helps many organizations to manage this. Is one thing is contracting rates. So the fact that an organization will come with a budget in their own currency. So in our hypothetical project, they had a budget of $5.5 million, and that was calculated into Swedish crowns for the contract. But that needs a rate to do that calculation, and often that's a negotiation about what rate should we use. Perhaps we say, oh, well, it's 9.1 now, the spot rate. Perhaps we should say 9.3. You put a little extra on that, and that provides organizations with some buffer. But of course, it also locks up a lot of Swedish funds in long contracts, where funds are unused if the Swedish crown doesn't go down. Another thing is implementation rates. So quite a few organizations have money left by the end of the year. And that, of course, also has to do with the contract rate. So you have perhaps spent 85% of your funding. You have an amount left that rolls over to the next budget year most often. And that's a part where it's affected by rates. So it's the size of that buffer, that's what's affected before activities are. So how much funding that actually goes on to next year. And that, in a way, you might say, well, that's great. It protects activities. You don't have to change your plans straight away. Well, yes, but on the other hand, organizations who are really close to their budget, who really push for implementation, who are close to 100%, they are now exposed to a higher financial risk than the others. And from a policy perspective, you might ask yourself, well, what kind of incentive then is there to really push for a high implementation rate if you're then exposed to a higher financial risk? So that's some of the findings when it comes to predictability and how organizations cope with them. But there are literally thousands of activities funded and a huge array of different organizations with different strategies. So these are, again, examples. A few other findings when it comes to a bit different question than is this with reporting and transparency. This is due to the fact that we give funds, we spend the entire budget is in Swedish crowns, but we report internationally in US dollars. And when that's done for the entire ODA, for the entire budget, that's calculated using an average annual rate from the OECD. And that's fine and well if you spend the same amount every month, but we spend most of the funds during the last quarter. So those are the rates that are most important when we calculate from Swedish crowns to dollars. And there will be quite a difference in between when you calculate with more exact weighted rates. A few percent might sound small, but since it's a huge budget, the differences could be up to 100 million US dollars for 1 year, or close to 1 billion Swedish crowns in the value reported. Also, I find it even more interesting is when you look at an individual activity. Look at an activity in OpenAid, for example. So you can see the funding spent by Sweden for an activity, and you can see it calculated in US dollars using this OECD rate. But the thing is, it's reported in a total amount for the entire year, without any information about when it was actually paid, and how many installments, how many disbursements did we make, and in what currencies. And we saw these rates before. As you can understand, there can be huge differences in the amounts that actually were received by the partner. So yes, we can say, well, we paid out 10 million, but how much did the organization get? And for someone trying perhaps to hold someone accountable and look how much funding did my local government or the local partners get, it's almost impossible to understand the funding they received. Those were briefly the findings in the report. when it comes to recommendations, there are a few, but the overall, I think, thing I would like to say here is, I think this is a problem that's maybe not the largest challenge one of our partners have in implementing projects funded by us, but it is something that we can quite easily improve a lot and at a small cost, or no cost at all almost. One thing is, and I think the top two recommendations are the main ones. One is we can provide predictable funding to a majority of our partners who work in major currencies, so dollars, euros, Swiss francs, British pounds, so on. Here there are readily available financial solutions through the National Debt Office, the Riksgälden, available to SIDA and to all agencies, government agencies, who can provide these currencies for SIDA at no cost. So for a hypothetical project, SIDA could say, well, we sign a contract of 50 million crowns, 10 million each, but we can guarantee it's going to be 1.1 million US dollar for these 3 years. So there would be a huge difference for an organization as that. A second recommendation is there's still a lot of organizations working in smaller local currencies, and there are no readily available financial solutions for many of those. But here I think it's possible to explore other financial solutions, perhaps using SIDA's guarantee instrument to put currency risk management solutions in place, so we can help support the activities that we fund in Swedish crowns. The third recommendation is working with transparent and efficient currency rates. So, I mean, and that will help if we have the first ones in place, because then they will lower the risk for most organizations. So don't depreciate the value of the Swedish crowns. That locks up a lot of funding that we can use to increase the size of the project or fund something else. And also ensure that the organizations that really push the implementation are not that they have positive incentives to do so, that they're not exposed to higher risk than others. And finally, increase transparency about financial transactions. And here I know SIDA is working on this, and hopefully we'll get something by this autumn where they will connect the reporting to new IT systems, so we will get data about payments and well, better data, basically. All right, thank you. That's my presentation of the report. I'm looking forward to questions and to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Are there any sort of clarification questions? Otherwise, we'll bring the discussants up. All of the discussants might enter the stage by now. We have 3 participants here. We have Georg Andrén, who is the Secretary General of Diakonia and Chairman of CONCORD, Sweden. We have Catharina Cappelin, who is Deputy Director at the Department for International Cooperation, Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And Whiteside, Professor Emeritus at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. So, to start with, you'll get about 10 minutes each to make your points. And I want to start with Georg. As I understand Diakonia's work, you're working with service providers in various countries through various partner organizations. So how do you and your partners experience problems related to this exchange rate fluctuations, or how do you manage it? Or, yeah, come up with the comments on the report as you like. You've got 10 minutes, more or less.
Thank you. Is this one on now? No. Is it on now? Yes, it is. Good afternoon. Thank you, Arne. Thank you, Númi, also for this presentation, and thank you for inviting me to this seminar. I was intrigued by the fact to sit down and discuss aid predictability from an exchange rate kind of angle. It's the first time I do that, and it's really interesting. Just to follow up on your presentation, Arne, yes, Diakonia is an organization. We work in 25 countries. We have round about 350 partners, between 350 and 400 partners in 4 regions. We have a turnaround of round about 500 million Swedish krona. So we are a small player in terms of comparing to SIDA and others, but we are one of the major Swedish civil society aid agencies. Our focus is human rights, democracy building, capacity building, gender justice, social economic justice, and conflict. And I say this because one thing, and that's important also for my remarks, one part of our DNA as an aid agency, as a civil society aid agency, is not only to finance partners, but to accompany partners in a rather long-term relationships. And the issue of predictability, therefore, becomes a central theme for us when we work. My comments now will be basically as a practitioner, as an activist, and looking at the situation or at this problem from our partner organization, or even beyond that, the rights holders' perspective and their expectations on Swedish aid. I would also do some comments from previous work, among others, as the head of the Africa department at SIDA. I was just talking this morning to a former colleague at SIDA just to remind me of how we try to deal with this situation. At that time, we had a budget of 5.4 billion Swedish krona to disperse to partners in 14, 15, or 16 different countries. For me, this discussion is about predictability, obviously, but also about risk sharing, which I find, for us at least, is maybe the most pressing part of the discussion. But before coming back to the risk sharing side, predictability, where volume is part of the predictability, we have other aspects of predictability is hanging on to thematic and geographic focus, hanging on to the DNA of Swedish development cooperation, which is institution building and so on. That's also part of the predictability agenda, which is not part of today's discussion. But volume is. And as CONCORD, a platform of Swedish civil society organizations of about 62 members, we have focused a lot on volume, but mainly focusing on the decision in Parliament and the kind of almost anonymous support in Parliament for the 1% of the net national income devoted to, and I see colleagues from different parties nodding, which is very encouraging to see that this is still the case. This is a strong support, and this is something that's important for Sweden. And we also, as CONCORD, and also as a member of CONCORD, Diakonia, we always remind government that this 1% needs to go all the way out to end users. And every time we see attempts to increase, or even actually factual increases of money being spent domestically in Sweden, diverts the Swedish focus on agency. But that's not part of this discussion either, but I have to mention it. So, but fluctuations is, and coming back to the whole issue of using money for domestic issues, what we saw 2015, 2016 is also part of a fluctuation when government is debatable, but decided to withdraw big amounts from the aid budget, and then with a short kind of anticipation gave them back again, gives aid lack of predictability and also problems of implementation, absorption capacity. So that kind of fluctuations are politically motivated, and we really find stressing. But fluctuations because of exchange rate movements is something much more complicated, and I really found it interesting to read through this report, and I also like very much, and I am compelled by the attempt to find technical ways of doing away with what we now are doing. We are pushing out all the way out to the end user the effect of the fluctuation. I was talking to SIDA this morning, I was talking internally to colleagues as well. What we do is that SIDA expects from us, SIDA is one of our major back donors, and we therefore, because of contractual kind of commitments, but also because of lack of own other means to do other things than to push on this to our partners. So what, and now we're going closer to the risk sharing side. What we then have to do, the SIDA practice, is to, when there is a loss because of exchange rate fluctuation, just as you said, Númi, this then, the donor, SIDA, or even us as Diakonia, we then have to go back to our donor and say, very sorry, rework your budget, and we'll have to look at this. If there is a gain because of exchange rate fluctuations, SIDA says, pay back. So it's a way of really pushing out the costs, but reaping the benefits. And this is a practice, we at Diakonia, we have small margin to kind of cater for these things. Our country offices, they go into negotiation with our partners to see, can we do anything? But we are not allowed to use SIDA funds to pay for, and I'm looking at the experts here. If they're nodding, I'm fine. If they are starting to look a bit worried, I need to remake my points. We are not allowed to take the risk ourselves. We are, however, allowed to negotiate that they keep part of the gains that they gain in a case of an exchange rate, a positive exchange rate fluctuation for them. But again, what happens is that this comes rather late in the year. We as SIDA, we have two disbursements normally. March, when we have the first kind of reports coming out from the former financial year, and then August, September, when we have audits and we have new plans, etc. When we in August, September then have to push our partners to renegotiate their plans or to even look at the kind of staffing that they have because of exchange rate fluctuations, what happens is that, of course, they learn who we are. So what they do is exactly what you say. They bring down expectations on what they have, which means that if we really honor the contract, they will sit at the end of the year with more money that they have planned for, and they have to replan, and they might not have enough time to really do this in a good way. So it creates buffers, and it creates unpredictability. So if we, or if government or SIDA can come up with kind of mechanisms whereby which we can cater for this, this would really help us. Our situation, however, is that we, of our 500 million, of which a bit more than 400 million goes directly out to partners, the big majority of this we sign in Swedish krona. So for us, it's Swedish krona vis-a-vis Uganda shilling or Mozambique meticais or pesos or whatever it could be. So it's that kind of exchange rate that we have to deal with. It's when we have EU contracts or when we have UN contracts, of course it's US dollar and euro, but it's mainly a Swedish krona and local currency problem. And we are really struggling with these issues because it does create uncertainty and it lowers efficiency in our partners' work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't know if you have any specific comment on this right now, or we'll take all the comments from the others. Okay. So, Catharina, are there any negative consequences of this for what the MFA is doing? Or can you work as suggested in the report, or what do you learn from this? Or, yeah, let's have your take on what we're doing here.
So, large questions in 10 minutes. I'd just like to start to introduce myself and my section a bit more in detail, because not a lot of people know about us, because we work mainly internally within the MFA, Minister for Foreign Affairs. So I'm heading up the section for budget and management, and in essence we are coordinating the handling of the development aid budget within the government offices. Mainly that work consists of the work with the annual budget bill that is presented by government to parliament and the amending bills. In our section is also the responsibility for SIDA, which is one of the government's 10 largest government agencies. Not a lot of people are aware that it's actually one of the largest, so I take this opportunity to say that. And with that comes, of course, the instruction, the annual letter of appropriation, and so on and so forth. So we were extremely happy when we learned that Númi, who we know from before in his previous capacities, we're writing this report because we think it helps us to analyze how to mitigate currency exchange effects within the development aid. And I also speak from personal experience, since I spent 5 years at the Swedish mission in Geneva working with multilateral governments, representing as a donor in the budget committees, in the strategic planning committees, and so on and so forth. And this was a big question, and a lot of donors were then grasping to find the answer. So this is one of the first studies of its kind, and I think this is just the first starting point where we start to analyze it. So it's work that we need to take on. Before I get into if and what the challenges are that Arne asked me to comment, I just want to continue for a minute or two along the lines that Georg started, to just set this in the wider scene. Exchange rate fluctuation, as is pointed out in the report, is one, but it's only one aspect that is affecting predictability and planning and efficiency in development aid activities. And also, I think we are all in agreement that predictability is a key principle for aid effectiveness. That's, I mean, I think we can all find consensus on that. Yeah. Fellow panelists are nodding, that's good. But it is an extremely difficult setting that SIDA and other development partners, multilaterals, are working in. We have local inflation, we have political context, we have changes of need, we have difficulty in project implementation that can be due to procurement issues, legal restraints, and so on and so forth. So I'm just also really concerned that we see this in a holistic approach. And when I look at the MFA, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and how we work in these issues, I know that this report, Númi, has limited or mainly focusing on the bilateral side, but multilateral core support is a third of the development aid budget. And out of the activities implemented by SIDA, about 35 to 40% on an annual basis is implemented via multilateral organizations. So how we work with these issues within the multilateral system is actually paramount. Sweden cannot act alone as one donor. We need to use donor coordination. We need to use our influence on the boards as big core support donors. The way we are acting in reform processes. Sweden has taken initiative to structured financing dialogues with several multilateral. And as new for 2018, the Parliament actually approved a larger beställningsbemyndigande ram in Swedish.
I was looking for that word as well. Thank you. Can someone say that?
Which basically... Oh, thank you. Frame of Outstanding Committee, which actually enables the government for the first time in 2018 to sign a number of multi-annual agreements with key multilateral organizations, both humanitarian actors and development actors, for several years. Then we can talk about really ensuring predictability. So I don't want to take the fun out of Númi's presentation, because then he will become very sad with me later. So I just wanted to give that kind of context, just to get the broader scope. And then to Arne's question, what hinders us? Are there any hindering? I think there are a lot of interesting suggestions in the report, and we have already initiated a dialogue with SIDA, and also very happy that the report covers a period up until 2016, and I'm very happy to say that a few initiatives has also started in the recent period after that. For example, one of the recommendations that you have is how we work with SIDA's guarantee instrument. And there is actually an initiative going on looking into how SIDA can use the instrument in order to provide currency hedging in other currencies. So that will be one work that is interesting to follow. SIDA has also initiated work on how to provide small payments, safe payments in smaller currencies, which is also can be interesting. There's also interesting work going on with the Swedish National Debt Office, Riksgälden, and what their role will be in the future in handling currencies for government agencies. SIDA is also looking, and this is also a key point from your report, Númi, the reporting side. And I know Alan liked this, you like data. And looking into basically how can we make a more transparent reporting, but also to follow up afterwards what the actual value were of the made disbursement. So to kind of learn from that. And actually also now, today, about 40% of SIDA's payments are done in foreign currencies. So if you look back just a few years, it was different. But we are seeing a move more towards being able to make more payments in foreign currency. So all in all, what's keeping us? I think we are doing the work, we're on the way, but we also need to be very careful to analyze in each step to be able to do this in a safely controlled way that ensures internal controls. And also, there needs to be done a cost-benefit analysis. I think Númi has pointed to that the instruments of hedging and so on, terminsäkring, are readily available. But they also need, and they're available for a low cost, the instrument itself. But it needs to be balanced for the administrative costs of handling these kind of instruments in a safe way while ensuring internal controls. So the cost-benefit analysis need to be made from a more holistic approach. And I think we have some work left to do on that side before we can implement this on a broader scope. As you can see, this is a subject that really motivates me, but I'll stop here and yeah, thanks.
Thanks a lot. We're all struggling with this, and I've been surprised when I looked around in the literature how little is done on this topic. Now, everybody is complaining, nobody's done serious thinking about it, and you wonder why, what is the problem, why have we not got any further than this so far, and maybe we can take that discussion up after we've had all the introductions here. But I think that's strange. If it's a serious problem, why haven't we done anything? That makes me a bit worried. Maybe it's not that easy as we think. Or, we'll see. Ella, you have an experience with research on HIV and AIDS. This is not an issue, obviously, only for Swedish aid flows, but you come across a lot of actors in Africa over the years. So how do they handle the risks, or how should they handle the risks?
Okay, good. I'm going to use the board because I'm an academic. I have to have a whiteboard there, and I need to declare an interest here. CEDA, and I've worked with CEDA for many years. It's been a real pleasure working with CEDA. Do you need that? You want to mic me up? Okay. I'll let you do that. This doesn't count for my attendance, please. Is that right? No? Is it not on? No, that's okay. Okay, good. So I need to declare an interest. We work with CEDA for many years, and I'm going to start this from a different point of view, because I worked on HIV and AIDS. I ran an organization called the Health Economics and HIV/AIDS Research Division in Durban for many years. So basically what happened is that we had an HIV epidemic which went something like this. People got infected with HIV.
Sorry, Alan, can you do
blue one. We had an HIV epidemic which went something like this. So there's the standard QT, the epidemic went up like that, and that was HIV. And if people didn't get on treatment, they died. Now, HIV isn't a problem everywhere. Let's be clear about this. It's not a problem if you're in Indonesia. Well, it is if you're HIV positive, obviously. But it's not a problem for the country. It's not a problem for the health system. But it is in southern Africa. And so the question was, how were you going to put people on treatment? And initially, treatment was incredibly expensive. $10,000 per person per year in 1996, but it came down very dramatically. So the question is, how are we going to put people on treatment? And the answer is, we as governments weren't, but the international agencies were. So you had PEPFAR, you had various other agencies coming in and saying, we will provide treatment for people who are living with HIV. Now then we have another problem, and that is that people looking at this curve of people now on treatment see it stays steady, because if you're on treatment, you will stay alive, and yet there are more people joining the pool because there are new infections, so the price is going up. So then the question becomes, and by the way, just to be clear, the issue is that in some countries up to 90% of treatment costs are being borne by foreign donors. So I think the first point about the very excellent report that has been written here is that we need to focus it down on specific sectors and specific areas. I think it's probably not that important for countries, this fluctuating exchange rates, but it is very important for the health sector, or sexual and reproductive health rights, which is a CEDA imperative, and it's vitally important for HIV and AIDS. So we looked at this issue of how many people were on treatment and where the money was going to come from. And I've been thinking about this for quite a long time. And this is why when we discovered the work that was being done by CEDA, we said, oh, fantastic, let's work together. We originally called our work, because I like catchy titles, we called it Snakes and Ladders. Because we saw the, do you have that board game in Sweden for children? Because we saw the exchange rates as a sort of game of snakes and ladders. You're going along, boom, 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 and your exchange rate appreciates. Up you go a ladder. And then it depreciates, and down you go as snakes. So the different report is called Snakes and Ladders. So we basically said, well, you know, there is a real issue here around exchange rates and how they fluctuate. And we looked around to see who was thinking about this. And frankly, and this is, again, Númi's report is really interesting. One of the fascinating things about it is that there's, and I'm going to say it's because there isn't, not because you didn't look hard enough, there aren't any recent references. People have stopped thinking about this issue. You know, looking at your bibliography, 2008, 2009, people don't seem to see this as important as it has been. So my view on this paper is it's really a very important paper, but what we need to do is work out who it's important for. And when I say who it's important for, I mean which countries. Sweden is unfortunate because your krona went down the tubes. Mind you, so did the British pound, so you know, what can I say? Yes, the pound went down the toilet as well. Yeah, so this wasn't great for the partners. US dollar is still rampant, and so is Donald Trump. Delete that from the recording, please. Anyway, so it's a question of who it's important for, and I think we have to be specific here. It's important specifically for some sectors and for some countries. And I hope that this is going to be, and the other thing which wasn't really mentioned in the report, which I think is quite important, is that there are some places where we can amalgamate countries. So, for example, in West Africa, we have the CFA area. In Southern Africa, we have the Common Monetary Area. So we don't need to even think about doing different thinking for Lesotho, Namibia, Swaziland, and South Africa, because they're in the Common Monetary Area. So whatever happens in one country should effectively happen in the other. The last thing I'm going to say is that I read this report and I thought about it, and I thought about the need to focus down on sectors and to focus down on countries. And at the moment I'm thinking about, and I'm hoping that EBA will join us in this bit of thinking, we're thinking that perhaps there are, in the development world, there are 3 distinct groups of countries. And the first group is the ones that we'll call upward and onward, which are countries where growth is happening. They are going to graduate. We don't want to be giving development assistance in 30, 40 years' time. We want to be moving on. So we have the countries that are the upward and onward countries. I would categorize Kenya as one of those. South Africa is certainly an upward and onward country. It's not one where we have to be involved for the foreseeable, for the infinite future. But then, of course, there are the countries that we are going to have to be involved in for the infinite future. And I'm going to call those countries the low and lost. And that's countries like Malawi. Now, I worked for DFID for a while, and there was something called the Malawi syndrome. And whenever anybody said Malawi, everyone went, ugh. But probably Zimbabwe, or maybe not. Maybe Zimbabwe isn't going to move out of that category. But there is a Burkina Faso, Mali. There's a country that I would call low and lost. And those are countries which are going to need development assistance for the long future. And some of those are high HIV/AIDS ones, which is really a problem because they can't afford to provide treatment. And then the category of countries, and I hope we might work on this, which I'm going to call the risky middle. These are the countries which are possibly moving up And if they do, then they lose a lot of the support. But perhaps they're just going round and round and round, and perhaps they're going down. And I think that if we're going to do development work properly, we need to accept that these low and lost are going to need support into the future. And the risky middle, which includes Rwanda, perhaps are countries where we need to do a little bit more specific analysis for that. And the reason I say Rwanda is because I was shocked and appalled today to read on the BBC website that Paul Kagame is spending millions on buying advertising space on the arms of the Arsenal players for the next season. Now that's something wrong. I hope that CEDA will be making representations in their development assistance and saying, what are you doing? Because it does make a difference if you make representations. And we saw that when Tedros appointed Robert Mugabe as the special envoy to the World Health Organization, which didn't last very long. So those are my thoughts. But thank you so much for inviting me. It has been a real pleasure to talk about this.
Thank you. And I think we need to start by giving Númi the chance to react to these comments. Do you agree with everything, or what?
That's fine. Well, I don't think I have any specific objections. I thank everyone for really interesting comments. I think if we start by just commenting on Alan's 3 different countries, one thing that I know Alan has mentioned before is when it comes to different country ratings, you have these formal ratings of countries that's affected by where you look at their economy, that affects the donor support that they get. And of course, their economy, an analysis of a local country is affected by the value of their currency. So it might be that the classification is not due to a real change in the economy, but a change in the value of that country's currency rate. So that's something interesting to look at. Well, Catharina, I'm happy to hear about all the ongoing activities. So we'll be really thrilled to hear about what happens there. And one question I have is, I mean, I've briefly mentioned some comments on the multilateral system, but do you know any best practices from the multilateral system on how they, because of course they are also donors. They have a lot of funding going out. So do they manage these questions in a way that we can learn from? That would be interesting to hear. A few comments.
Thank you. I think there are several good examples within the multilateral system, but I think the lack of it is the systematic learning processes and how we learn from these as donors from these examples. So the examples I can give are more from a personal experience from my time in Geneva, but I would be the first one to say that both donors and also the multilateral organizations need to be better in this kind of institutional learning. And this is not only when it comes to currency effects, it's a vast issue, vast, palette of governance issues that I think could benefit from this kind of institutional learning. During my last year in Geneva in 2015, the Swiss franc got rid of its peg against the euro. So currency effects was really the talk of the town in Geneva during that spring. And I had the opportunity to visit a number of organizations to just see, how do you manage? How do you do it? And I actually had one of the big Swedish commercial banks with me who did it as a fact-finding trip to know how can they work with the international organizations on these topics. And I know I shared some of these experiences with Númi previously, and I was quite interested to learn that some organizations were more, cash in hand, cash in, cash out. There was no real policies on investment policies, cash management policies, and so on, others. While others, such as the WHO, World Health Organization, and the ILO, were being really professional. They were buying financial instrument on London platforms in a really professional way. Well, other organizations such as IOM, International Organization for Migration, they use the natural hedge. If you have activities, 5,000 projects in 400 different places around the world, then natural hedging, that means you have your income in a number of different currencies and you have your payments in a number of different currencies. That worked for them. Together with, they used a buffer, which they called for operational reserve income. Basically, it was like an overhead buffer in the central budget at headquarters, which could be used as a buffer so that projects didn't have to take the full effect. So I think, and other organizations that are really interesting in looking into, I think you mentioned them in your report, is Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance. I also think the Global Fund has some interesting things going on. And these are the kind of example of a more recent multilateral organization, horizontal ones, focusing, as you were saying, Alan, on a sector or a specific topic. So I think the lessons are out there. There are many good examples, but now is really the challenge is to kind of collect them and then to act upon it. And I think that's what would be the next step. So, yeah.
Thank you. You triggered me a bit with your hedging thing. I'm not a financial economist, but I'll come back to this thing about hedging because I think there are other ways of doing it. I'd like to take us back to internal Swedish governance issues in terms of how to build in a transparency or a flexibility to avoid the kind of non-risk sharing. We as civil society organizations are just now fighting with SIDA because SIDA has taken a decision on partial risk sharing in terms of the part of the funding that comes from the civil society frame, but with embassies we are still in a situation where we, or rather our partners, take all the risk. There is no discussion, and it's not only about exchange rate fluctuation, but it's also incidents of corruption, etc., where we are fully, of course, responsible to pay back, but there is no kind of risk-sharing discussion. I think that needs to be also discussed because what we are talking about are the weakest and the most vulnerable organizations in the system, and they carry now all the risk. But I would like to come back to the hedging in another kind of a context, and that is building in flexibility in budgetary rules and regulations in this Swedish fiscal kind of framework, where I remember when I was heading the Africa department, myself and the controller and the heads of cooperation at the embassies, come August, September, October, we were really chasing so that every strategy, every country paid out between 95 and 100% of the amount allocated for that country for that year. And that became a pressure to spend, rather than allocating funds to where they had made the best use. What we managed to do at that time was or government decided, which I think was good, to initiate not yearly allocations to strategies, but strategy or allocations covering the strategy period, because that gave us some kind of flexibility between the years. And then government did another thing that was very good. It allowed SIDA to move money from one year to other in both ends, not only savings but also deficit, so that you can actually a bit cater for this kind of fluctuations. This gives you some kind of leeway apart from your innovative suggestions for how to do innovative financing to make sure that you don't cover too big costs in terms of fluctuations. But there's another thing that I think really could be done also to really support what you are talking about and to give the system flexibility, and that is this word I was looking for, the frame of outstanding or future commitments, where I think SIDA still has locked, or government, not even MFA, I think it's Minister of Finance, that locks in that every budget allocation, Africa, Asia, multilateral, etc., has its own frame, and you can't move between frames, which means that you build in a rigid system. If you open that up and give the agencies the possibility to move around and to cater for fluctuations, I think that would help also in making sure that you don't push all the risk out to recipients.
Thank you, Georg, and I think thank you especially for highlighting those aspects of predictability that is provided by the multi-year strategies and the strategy amount. And it's also allowed to deviate plus minus 10% during the strategy period, but in a specific budget year, it can deviate more than that. So that actually is a built-in flexibility into the system that is quite unique compared to other countries. So I'm happy you brought that up. On the final point, and this is an ongoing discussion between the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and SIDA, and of course the Ministry of Finance, the frame for multi-year outstanding. I love it. I rarely get to speak about that outside my office. I didn't know there was such interest for it. We can have a lunch we can talk about it. It's actually decided by Parliament. So that, just to be very, very clear, it's not the government. It's decided by Parliament. It's included in the yearly budget bill. But the changes that you are talking about between different appropriation items, anslagspost, a word I learned in English yesterday, is actually subject to government decision. So I think in the last year, since I arrived in this post, we have a quite dynamic discussion with SIDA on the needs of changing this, and this can be done in the letter of appropriation. So, but it needs to be set within this total frame that has been decided by Parliament. So we can't do anything we'd like there. So I just want to say that. And for the budget year 2018, the government actually made a change to create this flexibility that you were asking for. And it's done for some of our largest thematic strategies for sustainable development. In previous budget years, and also in the previous government, there were 3 different appropriation items for the strategies for sustainable social development, sustainable environmental development, and sustainable economic development. These are large strategies, total amounting to 3.5 billion kroner a year. So not as large as the Africa item, but it's still a considerable part of SIDA's global thematical programs. In the budget year for this year, the government decided to merge these 3 appropriation items into one, and that was for 2 reasons. The first one was to create the flexibility that you were asking for, allowing SIDA to cater to different needs within the 3 strategies within a single appropriation item. And the second one, which is the most logical one, is that we shouldn't see the 3 different perspectives of sustainable development as separate programming. Economic, social, and environmentally sustainable development are all interlinked and need to be treated as such in programming, in follow-up, and in the financial governance. So that was also one step in meeting those needs. So.
Alan first, and then I'll let Númi.
I just wanted to add one thing to what I was saying earlier. Is that got on now? Right. The reason why we get so excited about this issue in the HIV and AIDS world is that, as I said, most of the HIV programs are funded by foreign donors. All the drugs have to be bought in hard currency. So effectively, as we see this pressure for domestic funding to increase, if your currency goes down the tubes, then you really do have a very serious problem. So I believe that when we look at this, we need to understand that there are questions of how much of your procurement has to be in hard currency, because obviously if you're paying for nurses in Zambia, then that's a local currency, and possibly because the tendency for these currencies is to go down, you will have more money available. Secondly, I think you need to look at whether or not your commitments are going to grow, and as I said, in low and lost, they are going to grow. And thirdly, I think there is a question about predictability, because if you're on AIDS treatment, if you miss doses, then you develop resistance and then you die. So it is a matter of life and death for some things, for some people.
Thank you. Just to bring it back to a comment Georg made about pushing the risk and the cost out through the system, I think it's really important to remember that, because, of course, if you look at the possibility to manage these kinds of risks, they are as the largest possible that they're up here in the donor donor side, and then you push these costs out to smaller and smaller organizations. And I think I just want to send that to Catharina to, when you look at a cost-benefit analysis of this, of course the costs, there's some costs in renegotiating and so on at SIDA, but of course the larger cost and the larger risk will be further out into the system. Yeah, but and also just to also comment on your words about this being part of the system and we are a small player. Yes, we are a small player. I just participated in a study where we looked at the Ministry of Health in Zambia, and they had 27 donors. So Swedish crowns were 20%. We're a big donor, but it's 20% of their funding, and they have so many different currencies coming in, and it's such a complex picture. So of course, yes, we can help out with part of this, but for them to really reap the benefits, we need to change the system. So it's a complex picture.
Well, it seems to me that there are out there somewhere some sophisticated solutions, at least to multilateral aid, where there's a matter of whether it's implemented or not, or whether we can take them down and use them. But it seems much more complex for the smaller currencies, the things that Georg was talking about. And Númi had some ideas in his report on using the guarantee funds of SIDA, whatever. Maybe could you spell out a bit more precisely what we do with the smaller currencies? You say we're going to experiment.
Yeah, I mean, and maybe
it's very tricky, I think.
Maybe that's something ongoing as well. But I mean, a possible thought is, I mean, there are options out there. The TCX fund, for example, that works with donor backing to provide currency management for micro-lending, for example. So that's donors saying, okay, if you have a loss, we will back that, providing guarantees. So, of course, it would be possible for Sweden to say, okay, we give a lot of funding to Southern Africa, for example. There are no readily available financial instruments, perhaps, for a lot of these markets, but we can provide the guarantee, the financial guarantee for someone to provide that for our partners to ensure that our funding is predictable, that they can have the funding they need. So that's something that could be explored. Perhaps build in some kind of natural hedging fund for smaller currencies, because we give to a lot of different countries. Why perhaps, I mean, we might have a loss in one country or a region, but we might make gains in another one. So if we have a common fund for those currencies, we could provide that backing for our partners. But two sketches.
But all this is possible within the current budget laws, for example, or whatever they come up with.
That's I leave that question for Catharina.
You're the one who works at the National Audit Office.
Yeah, I would say it's very possible. No, I think it should be possible. The instruments are there. When it comes to the larger currencies, the services there with Riksgälden, with the National Debt Office. So quite a lot could be done. But I guess yes, it's a question of how to organize the administration around it. From an outsider's point of view, it sounds like it looks like an easy thing, but it always does from the outside.
Another small thing I thought about, as an academic, we normally apply for research grants for 3 years, like in your case here. And in our world, the project never ends. It goes on. Let's call it something else after 3 years. So we want to continue, and but we're not sure we get an approval after 3 years for new projects. So we try to retain some buffers from the old as an insurance as well. So is that the same kind of mechanisms here, that projects don't end after 3 years? They're going to continue in some sense or other, I guess. So is there possibilities to have buffers moving over the budget years? Not too much, I guess. But that's the way we think. Just to keep some money as a hedge. It's a good thing maybe sometimes.
Wow, this is really turning out to a great day. I get to talk about all my favorite subjects up here. Yeah, but it's actually even more elaborate like that. The governance of development aid funding relies on a number of key principles, and some of them we've been already mentioning up here from the stage today. But we also have something that's called the 50-70% rule, which means that we have a multi-year strategy for a country in Africa, let's say, and then we do a funding envelope, a total amount for the 5-year period. So let's say 1 billion kroner over 5 years. That means that SIDA can deviate plus minus 10% from the billion, but they also, in a 1 year, they can disperse 400, 1 year they can disperse 0, depending on the context, the needs, the planning and procurement and other factors and so on and so forth. But in order to avoid the situation that you are mentioning from Swedish University of research grants, we don't want a strategy to end on, December 31st, and then a new one will have to start and, build up from scratch on January 1st. So there is the 50-75% rule, which is basically allows SIDA to continue contracting and planning beyond the end of a strategy period and into a new period, even if that strategy hasn't yet been decided by the government, which means that you don't have these abrupt cuts. So you can have a more long-term programming that goes even further than the 5 years. And this is enabled to the government agencies thanks to the multi-annual frame for outstanding commitments. Yeah, so there are these factors in place to allow that.
Maybe we should let you guys come in as well. Are there any comments, questions? Yes, please.
I have a comment. I work for SIDA. I'm SIDA's Inspector General, so I travel around looking at embassies, and I don't often go into the details of a singular program, but I've also worked with follow-up for many years. And I think that, I forgot to say first, what an interesting discussion. I think I'm as nerdy as Catharina Cappelin, so this is fun. And I work with this all the time. But one thing I wanted to say is that, I think that the study was interesting, but when you do a study, of course, you have to base it on the ideal program. So it's this, what was it, 50 million, 5 years, 10 million per year, and so on. But when I do trainings, when I go to embassies, one of the things I say is that, okay, you make a plan and you agree on the plan, and then the only thing that you can be absolutely sure of is not going to happen that way. It's going to happen in some other way. And I think that is mainly the main criticism maybe towards this, to doing all these things that will cost a lot of administration, because maybe in April next year they didn't use the 10 million and the report's not ready. And so, that's the kind of flexibility that you work with the smaller programs all the time. And of course, we can only pay as the money is used, which is by Swedish law. Anslagsförordningen, I don't know, Appropriation Act. So, we have to check that the money was actually used before we can remit new funds. Even if it says 10 million, it very often happens, and I check this, that they pay much less. Because I don't know why, and that's interesting. If this is a strategy, then I think that's something to discuss with partners. But normally I just think that you're more optimistic in general, then you want things to happen faster. So I think that for many smaller programs, this is just, it doesn't work that way. It has to be much more flexible. And then I'm sure there are many things we can do. And I think SIDA takes pride in Sweden in being a flexible donor. So in the instances where they lose, there is a discussion, and you change the budget and so on. The budget is changed every year anyway. We always get a new plan and budget normally, so it's built into the system. So I think that there are many good things here, but I also agree that, if you're then working with, HIV doses, then I can understand. Then this can have a real effect. To guarantee the money, but for many other programs that are much smaller and much more diverse, I think it's going to be quite difficult. But as Catharina said, a large part of this funding that Sweden gives is the multilateral system, and there we have all the opportunities, I think, to work with this, because I don't think that there is ever the ambition to push the risk out to the small organization. And I don't think it happens that often that they would have to replan because of lack of funding. But so Georg is nodding, it happens obviously, but not that often. But anyway, thank you.
Yeah, that's such an interesting comment. I ran a program in Durban, which was what they called a JFA. Do you know what I'm talking about? A joint JFA, joint funding arrangement. It couldn't be an agreement because the donors couldn't agree, but they could arrange. So our donors were Swedish CEDA, DFID, Irish Aid, the Dutch, and one other who I'm forgetting, and they'll kill me for it. But there were 5 of them who came up with a joint funding arrangement. Not an agreement, an arrangement. And it was really interesting because we had a huge amount of money. And my problem was that my staff dreamed huge. They had fantastic ideas. But when it came to actually spending the money, they treated it as though it was their pensions or their children's college funds. And they just bloody wouldn't spend it. And I think that's true across so many organizations. Your experience?
Yeah, of course. Of course.
And I don't know the answer to that.
Right?
Yeah, thank you for a really interesting comment. I think, no, I agree with you, and I try to really underline that in the report. This is one challenge out of many. These organizations work in really complex contexts. So, but I think that this is an opportunity to remove one of all these challenges that might make it easier for them to plan and budget. And there will happen things. And then the question is then, how do you manage that, the administration for that? You need a cash management prognosis. So how many dollars will you need? And I think the solution will be an aggregated fund. So you say, well, we have these many hundreds or thousands of activities, and this portion wants dollars, and we will likely spend this much during the year in dollars and get that amount every month. Some will be delayed, some won't. So that's a question of a cash management prognosis. How much dollar will we spend? How many will follow the plan and how many won't? And hopefully in an aggregated view you will be able to provide them with predictable amounts, I think.
Can I just have a comment on that?
Yes.
I mean, it sounds great, but I think that the struggle there would be that so many of the organizations that we work with, and maybe that Diakonia works with, they don't have that type of capacity of doing that type of analysis. So, I mean, we have trouble getting a good budget. And so we discuss the budget, we go through it, and then in the end we get a report, and then it still doesn't match, and what happens. So, I mean, and I'm not trying to say this to make someone look bad. I think it's a matter of, I mean, we're in development cooperation, we're working with small organizations, maybe with volunteers sometimes. So, I mean, I think it works for bigger organizations with more predictable needs for the funds. Then I think this is a great idea. But for many smaller organizations, I just think it's, yeah, it's just too much work probably. But I'm not saying, I mean, in general, I think it's a good report.
Yeah. Now, can I just clarify? Because in my proposed, I mean, this is just a recommendation, but my proposed recommendation is that there's no additional work for the organization. It's upstream. I mean, it's upstream. The work is all for CEDA. I'm sorry, but I mean, the organization will come with a budget in their currency. Yeah. So they will say, yeah, yeah, at CEDA. Yes, yes, yes. I mean, you are paying out the funds. So for you, you'll say, okay, we have 500 partners who want dollars. It's like, I mean, and you look at the contracts and you look at disbursement, planned disbursement dates, and you say, what's the likelihood that we will pay according to the schedule? We look historically, you have all the payment data. So we'll say, well, it's likely 80% that will get the funds or request the funds when they plan to, and so on. So it's all about you having dollars in your account at the right date, and then dispersing it to the partner. So for them, it's only less work. I mean, they work in their currency. That's the most important thing. We should remove one thing in this equation, and that's the Swedish crown. It's only a figure like a number in the contract, and then they can forget about it. They can remember their 1.1 million US dollar being dispersed annually or whatever. So, yeah.
Catharina, you mentioned something about the administrative cost of FX or currency forwards. But currency forwards is used by even the smallest corporate to hedge their future cash flows. So what's the big difference here? Why is it so, as you said it, administrative burden?
Okay. Well, I'm not sure we are there yet in the discussion, but I want to drag the issue down to the bookkeeping and the accounting, because we have had a lot of technical discussions in Diakonia, as Georg have heard as well. And I just want to say that I'm very happy that this issue is being brought up, although we start on national finance level and not so much the technical bookkeeping issues yet, but it's a very good start, and it will get us to the point where we can actually have clear definitions of what we are talking about. Because I think the problem or the issue is quite large. You can just talk about currency gains, currency losses, because it means different things on different levels. So we need to be more specific, and I think, at least I wish for it, to structure the problem, to agree on definition of concepts. What are we meaning when we talk about currency losses? On what level are we? Are we in the forwarding organization like ourselves? Are we in the partner stage, and so on? So I guess we will get there.
Very quick.
Okay, I'll stop there.
Okay, there's one behind you as well. You've got 20 seconds.
Hello? Yes, no, I would just comment you mentioned these small exotic currencies, and depending a little bit on what currencies we're talking about and how large the amounts are, there are in fact ways of hedging these type of currencies as well today. So I don't think we should exclude many of these small African currencies. One can manage those as well, just to clarify that.
Okay. Anyway, we have a bunch of outstanding questions here, but I also want to give you the chance to conclude. So you have 1 minute each, and you'll answer the questions as you go. Catharina, start.
Wow, 1 minute.
And 20 seconds.
20 seconds. First, I'd like to thank Númi and Eba. It's been an extremely interesting discussion today, and I take a lot of ideas with me from these discussions. I want to reply to the question I got on the administrative costs, and thank you for following up on that in the event that I was being unclear. I didn't refer to the cost of the instrument themselves. I meant actually that in a cost-benefit analysis, you also need to calculate the costs of the staff, for example, needed, the actual man time needed to handling this, for example, at SIDA, and that also includes ensuring safe, handling, the quality assurance, making sure that Númi's previous colleagues at the National Audit Office also finds that any new routines that are implemented are being in accordance to the rules and regulations that we need to apply, and the capacity to follow up on that. And the reason why this is challenging, and I'm not saying that this is an obstacle or a chance that can't be surpassed, but it goes back to what Georg spoke about and the flexibility of the budget and the way that it's structured today. SIDA has a number of appropriation items, and the savings and credits that you mentioned, they are stipulated on each administrative appropriation item, and the same with the multi-year outstanding commitment frame. So it's quite of a challenge for SIDA to make sure to stay within these boundaries with several parameters for each separate appropriation item, and especially with an appropriation item like Africa, which is now amounting to something like 6.8 billion kroner, but it's with a number of strategies that are each with different periods and with different amounts over a strategy period. So that's what I meant when I spoke about administrative costs. It relates to the staff that needs to be able to handle this in a way that ensures strong internal controls. So that was...
Thank you.
Yeah, I think just to say that this is a really important subject. CEDA has been a forerunner in this, and I think the important thing is to keep it going. I think if you want to, you would find there's a real appetite among other donors to look at this, and I would encourage that you do so.
Okay.
Thank you. I'll try to be as brief. There's a Swedish saying, I think it was Astrid Lindgren that said it. It's, om man är stark måste man vara snäll. If you are strong, you need to be nice. And it has to do with the upstreaming of things. I think that when we talk about development cooperation, we talk about working with the weak institutions that are just up and running, trying to organize themselves and doing a good job. If we can lessen the burden, this might not, Madeleine, be maybe the most crucial kind of predictability issue, but if this can also be taken away, and if we can find ways upstream to lessen the burden of these organizations, a lot is won. So I do think that these recommendations are interesting. I will go, when I go back, I will talk to my colleagues and to Christer and others to see what can we, because we are discussing, should we start doing kind of different instruments for exchange rate, for hedging or for whatever, futures or options or whatever these are called. Should we go into this market or not? Again, taking things upstream and lessen the burden for partners. That would be my recommendation.
Thank you.
Right, thank you. I just want to thank everyone for all the really interesting comments and the discussion and the questions from the audience as well. I'll just say, I mean, this is, again, as Georg also mentioned, perhaps not the biggest problem, but an area where I think there is a lot of opportunity to improve things and find innovative ways to solve challenges that shouldn't be a challenge, basically. So hopefully there will be a lot of interesting things coming out from the MFA and from CEDA and hopefully from other donors as well, as we are only one part of the system. Thanks.
Thank you. And to conclude, I think this seminar has shown that there are best practice out there somewhere for the large donors and multilaterals anyway. That's a matter of implementation. But the challenge is, of course, the smaller ones and the low-end vulnerable that Alan talked about. And these are the guys that need stability. So that's where the focus is. So there seems to be the greatest challenges are, and the needs are the greatest where the facilities are least developed. And that's why we need to develop this further. And it is a concern, I think, that so little has been done globally on this, since we agree that it's important and seems straightforward to do if you can get it through the legal system in a way. Maybe we can get CEDA to work in dollars rather than Swedish crowns or something. That might be complicated. But it would make life easier in some sense. So I think we are getting there. And this is one of the reports from EBA, I think, which has a concrete policy conclusion, which we have been accused of not having all the time before. So this is as concrete as we get. And I think it's an interesting discussion which will continue. And I'm sure CEDA and the Foreign Office will bring this further. And I think we should also link up with the rest of the world, because this seems to be generally a big problem. Aid, as we see it, is going to change quite a lot over the years. So this risky middle, they might need other facilities. They need some kind of insurance against falling commodity prices or this and that. But the bottom 30 countries or something like that, they'll really be dependent on this kind of stability which is required, because they don't have much capacity to deal with it. So that's quite important. So this is a good report. I really like it a lot. And if you're not tired by now, I could tell you that our next seminar will be on Tuesday, June 12 at 9:30 to 12:30 at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where 3 recent PhDs will present summaries of their respective dissertations, all on the theme sexual and reproductive health and rights. That should also be an interesting seminar, and not much on exchange rates, I guess, but that is relevant there as well, as you know. So thanks a lot for coming, and have a nice day.